cut me a block at 22.5, okay? What? Oh, okay, boss man, sure. I love this thing. Nice. You got that block cut yet? Yeah. Come on, seriously? Dollar waiting on a dime here. Hey, how'd you cut that? You know what, Jack? If you take the time to learn how to do this, you'll become $1 too. Hey there, this is Dan with Dan and Sarah Makers. We've got another Tool Tuesday, and if you couldn't guess by now, we are going to be talking about speed squares. Modern squares are going to be either aluminum, plastic, or steel. I don't have any of the steel ones anymore, I used to. But they take on several different forms. Typically you'll have a small 7-inch square and a 12-inch square, and most companies do make them in both sizes. And then also, Stanley has this one that's a little unique in that it actually has an adjustable angle here. Most squares have and still do come with an instruction booklet, as you can see here, different brands. This modern Empire square here actually has a laser etched, I'm not sure what that is. You take a photo with your cell phone and it will link you to a website where you actually can see all this information on the website. But that's what they used to come with. So I kind of equate speed squares with a car in that most people use a speed square to the extent, or know how to use it to the extent of correlating it to a car where you can only drive forward in your car. If you know how to use all the different features of a speed square, you can go forward, you can go reverse, you can turn left, you can go right, you can slow down, and you can speed up. So let's make the most of our tools by learning how to use them, and let's have some fun. Say you're laying out a plate for framing a wall. You'll make your marks on your centers. Here I'm going 12 inches on center just to show. And you'll come back with your speed square. You'll put the fence, which is on the back, against the board and line it up with your mark. And draw your line and make a mark on whichever side of that mark you want your stud layout to be. That's great. That's something that everybody does. We all need our speed squares to do. One thing that we're going to look at is sometimes you're going to have multiple trimmers, king studs, cripples, things like that around door and window openings, or to support a post or a load-bearing point in a wall. Sometimes you want to mark both sides of your studs. Well, instead of getting your tape measure out and marking every 1.5 inches so that you get multiple lines, one thing that you can do is you can rely on this little gauge right here, which when we take our tape measure and measure, it starts at 1 inch here. Each one of these round dots is another inch, and it goes to 3.5 inches. These little hash marks here are 1/4 inch increments. So if I want to do 2 studs, I'll again line my square up with my initial line, draw my mark there, which would be 1.5 inches, and then I can come out here and do 3 inches. I'll bring my square over, I'll draw my line. If I'm detailing plates for actually framing, I may do a king and a trimmer or something like that for a door opening. So that would be one way of doing that. Another feature on the inside of this triangle are these notches here, which are also beneficial for if you ever have to do a rip. So basically, you'll just scribe along, and it's a little bit challenging. I don't do this very often, but you can use your pencil, and as you can see, it digs in, it catches on things. It's not the easiest and most accurate way of doing it. An actual skill saw will have the fence or the rip table on the small side. From the blade to the outside of the table is 1.5 inches, and from the other side it's 3.5 inches. So if you ever need to rip something to 1.5 inches or 3.5 inches, just use the table on your skill saw and that'll give you a rip. Another thing that a lot of people will use a speed square for is to use it as a protractor. As you can see, there are all these lines on the outside edge that go from basically 0 to 90 degrees. All these DEG period, that stands for degrees, and that indicates all these. So if I want, say, a 10-degree slope, I will hold my square at this top corner here. On the opposite side, as you can see, it says pivot, and it has an arrow going there. I'll hold that, and I'll keep this point right here as my pivot point. It'll stay in contact with the board, and I will raise this end of the square up and away from the board until that 10-degree hash mark line is flush with the edge of the 2x4 or board, whatever size it is. I make that angle there, and I know that I've got a 10-degree angle, and just so you know, it's this angle here. That's our 10-degree angle. If I want to go from the same pivot point, and this time, so we can see again visually, if I want to go to a 45-degree angle, I will complete and rotate this square all the way until that 45-degree line is on the outside face of the 2x4, making sure my pivot point's in the same spot, and I'll draw my line. Again, from our square line to there is 45 degrees. We can check that by flipping our square over. This is a 45-degree edge from the factory. We bring that in, and we've got 45 degrees. So that's great. It's a protractor. It'll give us a whole 90-degree radius, quarter of a circle. We could flip it around and get our half circle and all that, but that's good for protractor usage. Now, when we get into the more interesting stuff, which is rafters, we've got common, hip, and valley rafters. And honestly, unless you're doing a little bit of a bump out roof over a bay window or something like that, where you're doing a small storage shed, or say a California or Blind Valley where you're overbuilding an existing roof truss system, a lot of people don't cut rafters that much anymore. Depending on what part of the country you're in, you may or may not use trusses, or you may cut in roofs. But on this side of the country, on the West Coast, we use a whole lot of trusses. So carpenters that can actually cut a roof or cut stairs or something like that are kind of few and far between. So being able to do this sets you apart from a lot of the guys out there. What we've got here is a miniature setup of a common rafter. We've got our stud wall here with our vertical stud and our two top plates. And we've got a ridge board here, which in this case is a 2x4. You'd probably want to use something larger. That way you get full bearing. We want full bearing on our outside wall, and we want it nice and square there at the bird's mouth. So this particular common rafter that I've cut here is at an 8 and 12 pitch. What that means is I've taken a conventional framing square and I put tape across here and here, the short leg and the long leg, so that this point here is 8 inches down from the corner. So if we put that on our wall, and we actually line the top of the tape up with the top of our truss, or common rafter, sorry, we've got 8 inches of rise for every 12 inches of run. So this is an 8 and 12 rafter here. What that means is that we've got 3 different angles on this particular common rafter that we need to cut. We've got a top cut, we've got our bird's mouth or seat cut, and then we also have one down at the end, which would be where our fascia or gutter or whatever we happen to apply subfascia down there would be attached to. Now we're looking at this next line here of numbers and these little hash marks at the bottom of this oval opening, and we've got common pointing to it. What that means is that we've been using our square as a square and drawing square lines across our board. But like I said with our protractor degrees here, we're going to pivot off that pivot point, but instead of looking at the degrees at the outside, we're now looking through this slot and we're paying attention to these tick marks on the bottom of the slot and these numbers. I said we're doing an 8 and 12, so I'm going to pivot off this pivot point here until that line lines up with the top of my rafter and the 8. So I would bring that in, look straight down on it, don't look at it from a large angle or else you're going to be off a little bit, and you draw that mark. That has become your plumb cut, which would be either this cut, or the one at the tail of the rafter. So basically this point right here, centered under your ridge, would be half of your building width from the outside face of the wall to the center of your ridge rafter. Once you've got that figured up and you know how long this rafter needs to be, and remember, that's going to the center of this block. So if you're using 2x material, you've got to subtract 3/4 of an inch off of both rafters from either side to take this 1.5 inches out. If you don't, your rafters will be too high. They'll be bumped up like that. So we make our little mark there. We've got an 8 and 12 pitch. We put our square so it lines up our pivot points on our mark. We bring it down to 8 and 12. That's our plumb cut for our seat, which again, like we saw, will sit like that. Now we want full bearing on this stud. We don't want to cut it so deep that we have a huge amount of material over here that is cut but not sitting on anything. We want to minimize the triangle that we cut out of here. The bigger the triangle, the weaker it's going to be. The smaller the triangle, also the weaker it's going to be, because all the force is going to be, if we take a little triangle out, we're going to have all that force bearing on just a little bit of our plate. We want to have maximum bearing, but not too much. So what we do on our square, if you notice, it's got this little triangle or diamond here. What that is for is we can actually bring our square down, and there's a little bit of guesstimating here because it is fairly small, but we bring it down and we can kind of draw across here. I like to do it really light the first time, and I'll take my square and I'll set it up so that this corner is equal to that. This line is lined up, and then I'll kind of look and I'll see if I actually got it square. Here it doesn't quite look square, so I'll just bring it up a little bit, and then it's just a matter of connecting the dots, drawing across like that. You want to exit out because obviously you don't want to accidentally cut the wrong side and ruin a rafter. We want to save as much lumber as we can by not making stupid mistakes. So, as you see here, if this was a top plate, our line winds up right over here. That means that this rafter will get full bearing on top of our top plate and maximize the amount of meat or material that's going to fly past the wall and support our eave or overhang. Again, we're going to figure out how long our overall rafter needs to be. In certain cases, you know how far you want your overhang to be. So you could either measure straight over, you can measure off the wall, you can run these wild, which some people do. Some people like to pre-cut them. But say we run them wild, once we get all our rafters cut for the seat cut and ridge cut, we get them installed on layout, and we'll go through, we'll make our marks, we'll snap a string line across the entire outside of the building, and then we'll come back through with our square, and we can mark our 8 and 12 to get a plumb cut. So that's how we would do a common rafter. Hip and valleys are a little bit different because their run is actually longer because they're on a diagonal, and I'll show you that with a little bit of a model here in a minute. So I thought long and hard about the best way to demonstrate and to show visually where hip, valley, and common rafters are on a roof, and the best way I could think of is a small Lego model. So a hip is where this black tape is. It's where two planes of the roof meet at an outside edge or corner slope. A valley is where two planes of the roof meet at an inside corner, and that forms a valley. And then the common rafters run from the ridge down to the eave, and they can be on either side like this, basically continuous all the way down. So another common use of a speed square is to figure out the existing roof pitch of a roof. Honestly, don't know that many carpenters that carry plumb bobs around all the time anymore. But you could hang a plumb bob off the roof, and you can see this isn't actually plumb or level where I have it mounted, but where I've drawn that line right there is now plumb, and I've got it off my initial line. So we'll take our square and we'll put it on there. We'll bring it back to that point there, and we'll read here. And where this table and everything is clamped right now, if you were going off true level, we're looking at just over a 7/12 pitch. Another way, which is probably a little bit more common, is just pull out a level, torpedo level. Find your level line, draw it, and then you can figure out again with your speed square. One thing that some people have said is to take your square, put it on the fascia. I've never actually seen anybody bother to do this. Take the plumb bob, hang it across there, find out what degree this is, and subtract this 50, oh, that's looking like 58 degrees from 90. So 58 from 90 would probably give us around 32 degrees. So if we were then to look at 32, raise it up to 32, that will give you, again, a plumb line. Another feature that we can use with a square is to actually set the table on our skill saw, or possibly the angle of our blade on our table saw. One of the key things, always make sure you have your saw unplugged, not just plugged in and not being used, but physically unplugged. Also, be careful the blades are sharp, and if you have to pull the guard back, which this one's actually being held back by just the fact that it's sitting on the table right now, do not modify your guards in any way, shape, or form. They're there for a reason. I've seen what happens when people don't use them on legs and hands and all kinds of nasty stuff. But basically, what we do is we take our square, put it onto our saw table, and we bring it over until it's meeting the saw blade down in the bottom corner. What we want to see is we want to see that square touching the blade all the way out to the edge of the blade here. Typically, drop the depth guard on your saw all the way to the maximum so it'll cut as deep as it can. That way you get your most accurate adjustment. Do not set your framing square so that it's bumping the side of a tooth. The tooth is wider than the blade. That way it's not worrying about the friction of the blade when you're cutting. Set it just on the metal blade. And what we'll do is we'll adjust our table until our square is sitting against the blade all the way up and down. We'll tighten it back, give it a little bit of a wobble. Sure enough, we're good. When using the square as a saw guide, being left-handed, I'll typically take the square and put the fence away from myself, and I'll clamp it to the board, and then I'll put my framing saw on there, skill saw, and I'll cut. Don't try and hold on to something that's going to come loose and drop down. So that's my recommendation there. One final good use for a speed square is when you're installing short cripples above, say, doors and window openings. And you've got layout marks on your top plate, but you don't have them on your header. Because obviously you just lay out your top plate and your bottom plate, you spread them, infill everything, and now you have to come back and put these little tiny cripples in across headers for infill. That's where a speed square comes in. You've got the cripple now nailed into your top plate. You take your speed square and you make sure it's square, and then you can fasten your cripple to your header. One word of caution here is that unless your entire wall has been squared up before you do this, you may find that your top plate, your header, and your bottom plates are all level and parallel with each other, so it looks good when it's laying on the ground. But as soon as you square and rack that wall, you found out that all your studs were doing this, and you rack that wall and bring it up to plumb or square, and all your cripples will be off. So what looks good on the ground, step back, get the big picture, make sure you've got your wall squared, then you can square these up with the speed square. Another good use for the square is to scrape things like sawdust, dirt, gravel, snow, ice, mud off of boards. You know, a lot of guys will use that. They'll just take their square and scrape all the material off that's on the board that's in their way. Then they'll go ahead and work. I hope you enjoyed today's Tool Tuesday on speed squares. Remember to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed what we did. Also, if you have any ideas or requests for types of tools that you want me to talk about in the future, go ahead and leave those there. Red Bull? Bleh. But their soapbox races are hilarious. So anyways, this is Dan with Dan and Sarah Makers. Have a good one. We'll see you next week.